I've spent the last couple of months really trying to wrap my head around narrative choices. Specifically, what can make a choice an iconic game moment, and what makes others fall flat. At first, it seems simple. Some choices are just better written, more impactful, or more dramatic. But the more I thought about it, the more complicated it got. What separates big moments like letting Megaton explode in Fallout 3 versus small moments like petting a dog? What makes choosing a conversation option in Dream Daddy feel different from picking a path in the Stanley Parable? And what about choices that aren't narrative at all? Like, I started going a little nuts, sketching out charts, mapping story options, just trying to find some patterns, and every time I thought I had like a unified theory, I'd think of an exception to the rule and I'd have to start all over again. But then something clicked. The only choices you get in a game are the ones a designer allows you to make. And I know that sounds completely obvious, but it shifted the question entirely. All of a sudden, it wasn't what makes a good or a bad choice, it was why give the player a choice at all? And that one question doesn't just reframe narrative design, it kind of gets into the essence of game design itself. And at the heart of it was the concept of design friction. The idea of design friction started as a user experience or UX term, and it was originally about highlighting the things stopping users from accomplishing the goal you set out for them. In web dev specifically, anytime there was an extra interaction point between the user looking for an item to buy and then actually pressing the button to buy it, that was the type of friction designers worried about. But recently the term has had a bit of a renaissance because designers realized friction can actually be pretty good. Slowing user down or causing them to pause can be a deliberate decision to make products better. Like in a game where you want to load a previous save, you'll get a little confirm box. That's design friction, but it's there to make you stop and think if you really want to override your progress for a previous save. That little bit of friction can save you from one little misclick ruining all your progress. But friction can also make using a product just feel better. For example, brownie mixes were once designed for just maximum convenience. Just add water and bake. Housewives felt guilty serving something so effortless. It didn't feel like real baking. So designers intentionally added a bit of friction, requiring users to just add an egg, making the process feel more participatory and authentic. This small tweak didn't improve the brownies themselves, but it dramatically improved how the users felt about making them. It's a classic example of design friction used not to obstruct, but to create an emotional investment. And this term is bled into game design because when you're designing a game, you're giving the user a goal, and the friction of the goal is the game itself. And in simpler games, you see this a little bit more clearly. Like in Candyland, the object is to go from one end of the board to the other, but you need to draw a card every turn, and then go to that next color or picture on that card. Friction. There's no strategy, you're just picking up cards and following along. The fun is all about the friction you and other players encounter along the way. Now, obviously, in more complicated games, there's just a ton of different types of friction. If you're exploring a huge game world, some games have a little mini map in the corner to show where to go next. Other games will make you set your own markers on a big map and point to the direction you set, and others might not have a map at all. And all three of those differing levels of friction alters how players interact with that particular aspect of gameplay. And that's like 1 out of 50 other things that you just have to worry about on this screen. So narrative games are on the simple side compared to open world games, and probably even compared to most action and platformer titles, because in these games you're making a ton of consequential second-by-second decisions, with multiple different goals you may be aiming towards simultaneously, versus narrative games where you're making just a few discrete decisions during a game. But the simpler you get with limited user interactions, the more important small little aspects can be. And even in a visual novel with no choices in it, like Witch on the Holy Night, you can find a lot of examples of different types of friction that have an effect on the readers. But honestly, it's kind of long. I haven't finished it yet, so I don't want to say anything definite about it until I finish it. But I did finish reading Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, so I can talk about that. So as you read this intentionally confusing book, there are occasionally superscript numbers next to a word. For most books, they aren't that important, usually just used to clarify some details that readers might miss. As you read through these first 50 pages, there's only 4, so most readers might just ignore them. Then you get to a page where there's like 5 of them within a couple of paragraphs, so suddenly it's like, oh, I better check these endnotes. That's when you flip through and see the endnotes start here, like 100 pages before the end of the book. If you're curious, you might keep flipping through and you'll see these endnotes range from small notes to excerpts from other non-existent texts and movies, graphs and equations, and then just huge chunks of text that go on for pages. These endnotes aren't just there to explain, they are part of the text. So in these first 50-ish pages, it's designed to get you to read it while you're always keeping an eye out for the superscript numbers. Then you go from the main text, you flip all the way to the end, and you end up flipping back and forth pretty regularly, and it's all necessary to get the full story. This is designed friction to purposely alter the way you normally read a book, giving you a sense that you're piecing together this grander narrative by just leafing through all these little documents, making you an active participant in decoding the story. And again, that's without choices, that's without gameplay, that's just through the narrative design available in a traditional book. So with those examples, that gives us a pretty good breakdown of what friction is. We have a goal, the path to get to that goal, and then friction is anything in the path that diverts or detracts from that path, with good friction adding to the path to make it more fun or interesting, and bad friction is anything that makes that path dull or frustrating. And your narrative game will usually have multiple layered, staggered, and sequential goals to give your players a sense of accomplishment to tide them over to the next larger goal. So let's break down 4 different common gameplay elements of narrative games so we can look at how we can apply or subtract friction to those aspects. And the first is text. Yeah, the most common gameplay element in narrative games is the text, and it's usually just a simple matter of a button press to move on to the next line of dialogue. Nothing to even think about, right? Wrong. Tons of design implications just in that little motion, and a lot of points of friction that you need to keep in mind. Is your font legible and visible? How big is the text? How fast does the text appear? Is it clear if it's narration text or a specific character speaking? Can any input precede the player through the next text, or does it have to be one button in particular? Does the text have VO? Can the text autoplay the next line? Can users go back to an earlier text if they miss something? These are all things to be considered. My biggest pet peeve with visual novels is the amount of text that appears on screen with each button press. I'm kind of a fast reader, so I can read through paragraphs pretty easily because I can see the general shapes of letters and how they stack, so a tight paragraph with upper and lowercase text is something I can read and understand quickly. But if it displays a line at a time, it's the reading equivalent to walking in lead shoes. It is a painfully slow pace for me to get through. I hate it. So most narrative games have options for text speed, high contrast text, font choice, size, and even let you turn on or off the VO if it has it. Points of friction that make it harder to physically read or understand your text are generally no bueno, and giving players options to tailor the reading format to their taste is a net positive for everyone. But text advancement is also where some fun can be had. In Mohamed Fahmy's What Comes After, it's essentially a straightforward narrative, no choices involved. To get through the story, you need to keep walking forward and backward through the subway train. You have the option to walk or run, but who you have to talk to in order to advance the story is telegraphed, super clear to the user where they need to go next. If they wanted, they could have designed the story to work with a single button press to auto-animate the character to the next portion of the story, but the physical act of walking around the subway train to talk to ghosts is some intentional friction to make you feel like you're participating in the story, not just reading it. And in my game King of the Cul-de-Sac, I messed around with inputs a lot too, and one of my favorite sections was when I set up a fight scene, so every tap caused this quick animation to happen. I added this counter, and I required a lot of button presses to get through, so you get the idea, oh, I should be rapidly tapping to get through this. So you feel like you're doing all these fast dodges and punches. And then in the game If Found, at certain parts of the story where the conversations get emotionally difficult for the characters to get through, it gives you control over an eraser to wipe away the thing that was hard to get through to proceed to the next screen. These little bits of friction make you pay more attention to the story moments you have to dig for. Keep in mind you don't always use the same method to advance text. Switching it up at certain parts of the narrative creates friction, but as long as there's a narrative justification for it, can really add something to your game. But aside from text advancement, a lot of games like to get lateral with it. Exploration branching. In a lot of narrative games, you don't just want the player to move forward through the story, you want them to explore a little bit, to linger. And I'm not talking about narrative choices, correct or incorrect choices, or even puzzles. And I don't even mean like walking around segments. I just mean any part of the game where you want players to try to figure out where the story continues. So for example, you might have a game where you need to find a particular townsperson you need to speak to. The game will let you pick a few areas of town to travel to find them, and the story won't proceed until you pick the right location and talk to the right townsperson. What once would have been a one tap to get to the next scene in a conversation becomes two taps, one to select the right location and another to select the town person. Except it's not just two steps. Say you have 4 locations and 3 different townspeople you can speak to, it could take players 12 tries before they find the right townsperson they needed to talk to. Or maybe someone gets it right on the first try, but they feel like they may have missed out on some important story details, so they go back to the other locations to talk to everyone else until they proceed. So something that's mechanically pretty simple can turn into this huge point of friction. And I'll bring this game up because it's a wonderful game, it's award-winning, so when I say this bit of criticism, please understand it comes from a place of love, but I hate the level design in 1000 Resist. Again, this is a great narrative game, it's one of my favorites. There's some mild gameplay elements and really only a few consequential choices that all happen at the very end of the game. But for the most part, you're experiencing a linear story by moving not only through space, but in certain sections by moving forward and backward in time. For me though, the trouble is when it has really big maps. At first, I assumed the main hub of this game was supposed to be intentionally hard to navigate to encourage you to rely on exploration. The crudely drawn map shows 2 levels, but it's actually kind of a maze-like process to get from one section to another. I found I took a break from the game less at the different chapter points, and more when I got frustrated I needed to get right there, I can see where I need to be, I just can't get there. Again, you'd think it's intentional, except almost every time there was a large area, I got lost. But that's actually like a really common pitfall for any game that involves any amount of exploration. Something that's supposed to give the players like a little bit of agency, all of a sudden becomes like a huge point of frustration. Avoiding that is a matter of highlighting the parts of that are fun and interesting, and either removing or creating patches for areas that could be pain points. For instance, in AI The Somnium Files, there are some casual point and click sections where you have to tap on characters for plot essential dialogue, or tap on important objects in the scene. Anything that you hover over and can interact with is labeled. Anything that you haven't got all the dialogue for shows up as green. And if you hover over something where you've already exhausted the dialogue for, it shows up as gray. Internally, this sets a flag that you've tapped on a necessary thing, and when you press on all the tags that are flagged in this section, it will move you on to the next scene. There's at least a couple of tags that require you to tap on the same character over and over and over again, so you'll need to tap certain things several times. So if you're the type of person who wants to tap on everything, you can tap on everything in the scene, and it won't auto-proceed for you. So while the point and click section is a bit of friction added to slow you down, it also uses design elements to keep you from retreading previous sections, subtracting some friction. But with long games like this, there's another element in narrative games specifically that can be the biggest source of frustration for players: narrative choices. Narrative itself can be a form of design friction. Choosing to save one character over another creates tension, not just because of the outcome, but because of the emotional weight applied to the decision. Even if making a big life or death decision, or making a small decision that may cause someone to live or die are mechanically the same, the friction the player feels can be wildly different. The more obvious and emotionally loaded the decision, the more friction it introduces, slowing the player down to reflect, hesitate, or stress. That's why friction needs to be balanced with an appropriate level of consequence. If you put a major roadblock in front of the player, like a tough moral choice or a high-risk gamble, there needs to be a reward or punishment proportionate to your effort placed on the other side. That's what gives the choice weight. It's a chain of emotional and mechanical cause and effect. Dating sims let you choose between different romantic partners. Grand epics can have you side with one faction or another, or let you choose between good and evil, but you can also use the thread of added friction to incentivize players to choose actions they otherwise wouldn't. An interesting example of punishing good choices comes from Saya Uta, or Song of Saya. Trying to be good leads to horror, while giving into darkness brings a strange form of resolution that may not align with every player's moral compass. Undertale is another great example of this. If you want to get through the game, you can beat up all the enemies in your path, but if you want the good ending where you don't hurt anyone, you need to take a longer, harder set of steps to get there. A bigger narrative reward requires more friction. But Undertale also uses another really useful gameplay feature of narrative games: failure. Failure is another type of narrative consequence, but while in the previous section I focused on different narrative choices that could lead to different, goals a player could be striving for, in this case, I mean failure to be when a player's path to their goal gets stopped or interrupted. This is probably the biggest bump of friction you're going to get in your games, because failure is a really common jumping off point for players. And failure is also a little complicated because once you introduce failure, you're also kind of implying what success is going to be. So whether you intend to or not, you're going to be teaching your players how to play correctly, and that might not align with your intentions. I've played through Fate Stay Night, and you'll reach decision trees where both options seem pretty reasonable, but while one continues the story, the other one will lead to kind of a joke ending. So what players learn is, I better save at every choice, because if I pick wrong, I'm gonna have to come back here. That is the correct way to play, and it kind of became the default for a lot of visual novels. But do you really want every choice to make players disengage from the story like that? And this usually isn't a clean binary. Making one wrong decision might not lead directly to failure, but repeatedly making wrong choices might. Maybe in a dating sim, you didn't buy the right item for a character when you had the time, and now you can't give them the item that advances you to the right point in their quest line. Or maybe even a stat raiser, you didn't build up a certain attribute, and now you've gotten to a point in the game where the difficulty just shoots up. So you have to consider failure on that pathway to the goal, and design multiple goals accordingly. Platformers like Celeste and Neon White keep failures tight and relatively frictionless. You usually figure out you failed pretty quick, and once you fail, you can immediately start over. And gameplay segments only take a few minutes at most, so these are pretty tight loops. In games like Hades and Getting Over It, players are expected to fail a lot, but as you gain experience and increase in skill, getting back to where you left off should get faster and faster. Roguelikes and physic climbing games make failure point of the process. You can also fail forward. In games like Pathologic, there are missions where you can fail, but instead of it ending the game, you find out things sort of work themselves out, but with some negative narrative consequences. So I covered text, branching and exploration, narrative choices, and failure as common gameplay features of narrative games. So let's look at how we design a narrative game keeping that type of friction in mind. So first, start with the text. We want this part to be as frictionless as possible. Without even reading the words, how does it feel when you advance from one line of text to another? Is it a pleasant experience? Is there anything you can do to make it more interesting? Point of reference for me is another printed book, Preventative Maintenance Monthly. Pretty boring. It's literally like equipment maintenance. When it was originally published, it was mostly text, but pretty soon it started looking like a regular magazine with illustrations and photos. Totally fine. But then they enlisted a young cartoonist named Will Eisner, who joined the staff, and he started making whole sections of instruction with comics and pinup gals. And suddenly, accidents went down wherever the magazine was made available. Soldiers actually kept their copies and paid attention because it was entertaining to read. So this is a great example of taking some text, removing the friction with art in a different format, and once you've made it so your base interaction is relatively frictionless, you don't have to worry about it so much, so you can focus on the story itself. Usually, stories have a structure, and while there are tons of shapes of them, generally your protagonist will have more and more troubles until the story hits a climax, and then the protagonist either gets what they strive for, or lives with the fallout of the climax, and we hit the natural end of the narrative. Rising action, climax, falling action. This is also how most traditional video games go. You want the game to get more and more difficult because the player is getting better at it, until you hit the end of the game, the climax, the boss battle, and you win. Now, it's usually not a straight line. It's a lot of peaks and valleys along the way, but this is a pretty good structure for your narrative game. Over time, things should get harder and harder for your protagonist. Take a look at a long-running series like Game of Thrones. At the beginning, almost everyone is at a place of comfort, but over time you learn the kingdom is in a more precarious situation than we thought, and there's a lot of scheming and danger happening. Even when we have scenes that are relatively calm, we're never quite as comfortable as we were at the beginning. Then, after Season 1 or Book 1, when the whole kingdom erupts into civil war, we reach a period where even at calm points in the story, things are never quite safe. Likewise, you should follow this template for your game. Just as a reminder, this is all story stuff I'm talking about in terms of like the actual plot line. But this is something you want to keep in mind as you add branching, exploration, narrative choices and failure, because your game's friction should never be as intense as the plotline. So a story about war and death and tragedy is totally fine as a frictionless kinetic novel because your game's mechanics are never going to get in the way of the story. But if you have a cozy slice of life narrative game about farming, but the difficulty spikes rapidly and it's super hard to get the good ending, the player's experience of the game is going to trump the narrative you're trying to present. So take your narrative, split it up into a variety of goals, which most visual novels just do chapters, and each of these peaks and valleys should align pretty well with your goals. Each one is its own self-contained story. Again, if you have multiple plot lines, you can stagger them instead of having them one after another, but over time, generally, you want the friction to rise and your default valleys to get higher and higher as well. Now, obviously, mapping out story intensity to game friction isn't very scientific. You don't have a solid measurement for that. You just have to make some educated guesses, playtest, and adjust your game until it feels right. So with that in mind, if you have branching and exploration, we need to map segments of the game to this larger story chart here. So if you have a big exploration section at the beginning, keep it manageable, but as the game goes on, you can make it more complex. Same deal with narrative choices. Yes, you can start the game with a heavy narrative choice, but players will generally expect the choices to get harder and harder over time. So let's remove some friction. Let the big narrative moment be something out of the player's hands, or have it come as a consequence of a small choice the player makes at the beginning. Again, there will be peaks and valleys, but the peaks at the end here should be much bigger than the peaks here. And if your story branches off in different directions, they should all rise, and then fall when it hits the end of that particular branch. If you have a pathway that just skitters down, you should keep in mind how that fits in the general story structure. Tragedies follow a structure where the climax happens more in the middle, and then everything is dealing with the fallout from there. And if you're dealing with an episodic game or series, you may end up doing these story charts again and again in sequence. But however you handle it, whatever kind of story you have, you're going to want to map the friction along with that story. And then we deal with failure. What happens when a player comes along to this part of the story and then, oh no, they died, they're done, time to start over. Classic narrative games would make these digression points bad endings, or treat them like you fell off the narrative path completely, but you need to add that into the larger journey the player is on along this chart. If they need to start over, where are they starting from? And factor that into the additional time and friction spike the failure in that chart. So the more possible points of failure, the shorter you should probably make the pathway to their next goal. Now this all refers to just the narrative aspect of things, but at a certain point when you add even more stuff like puzzles, mini games, all the way to open world RPG gameplay and beyond, you're ceasing to make just a narrative game and you're starting to rely on a game loop to keep players engaged. And that's when you need to shift your perspective a little. When gameplay becomes the driving force of your game, you need to acknowledge that it becomes the dominant way the player experiences your story, and you'll need to prioritize it. So while you're still going to want to create a goal you want the player to reach, and you're going to create some friction along the way before players get there, you need to factor in all the other sub-goals a player might have for themselves along the way. So in gacha-style games like Uma Musume Pretty Derby, there's a main story, event stories, and character stories, but you progress through those stories by training anime horse girls to race fast. So you need to get a strong roster of base characters and trainers, use those to breed and train a stronger horse girl, get rewarded, and then use those rewards to build a stronger roster and more support cards. The written story might be about Gold Ship, but my experience story is about how hard it is to win the Tenno Show Spring Race. Why are you so slow? We call this cycle a game loop, and your gameplay largely revolves around you getting stronger and stronger with each loop, and the game presenting larger and larger challenges. Keeping consistently challenged but never overwhelmed or bored is called the flow state. And when you're dealing with game friction, our primary worry is what pushes you out of that game flow. The friction that's applied is usually the game difficulty itself, but as a story, it can be a point of friction that takes you out of that state. This is why a lot of modern games try to integrate the narrative into gameplay moments, sometimes turning narrative choices into game loops unto themselves, like with morality and faction systems, or games where you need to explore all the different timelines you can create. It's really hard walking that tightrope of mechanics and story. Not impossible, just hard. Just like you need to playtest gameplay, you also need to playtest the story along with it, which often means you'll be cutting stuff out, simplifying it, or making some story optional. You can also hit the point where your story is at odds with your gameplay loop, and then you have to make the choice to change the game or the story. And the nature of game development usually makes it a lot easier to change the story not the game. So that's something you should be wary of. Like, you may have heard Devil May Cry started out as a prototype for Resident Evil 4, but the gameplay mechanics led itself better to a frenetic gameplay style. So Capcom repurposed the prototype into a standalone title with a totally different narrative style that fit its gameplay. Now in practice, it's usually a little bit more back and forth, removing any friction that takes players out of that state and adding friction to gameplay elements that add to that story and vibe, while keeping the player in a flow state. So it's more of a juggling act to build out the narrative in a game like Yakuza Like a Dragon, which has a ton of different gameplay elements, versus a tighter indie story game like Gone Home. And even the approaches to applying friction may be pretty different, but they're both using the same trick. And now we finally have enough context to see how that trick is done. To review, with a kinetic visual novel, get the text advancement to feel right, and you can focus on the story. But if you add friction in the form of branching and exploration, narrative choices and failure, you want to keep the friction below the intensity of the narrative. But once gameplay becomes the central aspect of that game, you also want to keep your game friction within that game loop. Now that seems like a bit of a paradigm shift, but it's really the same thing. You're trying to keep the player's attention on the most interesting part of your game. If your narrative is the most interesting part, you want to shave away anything that starts to overpower your narrative. But once your interactions with the game become more interesting, suddenly you want to shave anything that keeps players from experiencing that loop. But there's other things about your game other than just the story or gameplay that could be the most interesting thing. If the most interesting thing about your game is how it breaks the fourth wall, you want to add friction in places outside of normal gameplay. If the most interesting thing in your game is its unique art style, don't let players skip past it. Add some friction so they have to look at it. If the most interesting thing is the characters, add points of friction to force the player to interact with the characters, and reduce friction whenever players aren't interacting with them. But sometimes the most interesting thing about your game isn't the game itself, but the way your players interact with it meta-contextually. If you have fans, they're talking about the game on Reddit and Discord. They're sharing screenshots on Steam and other social media. They're sharing guides, they're speedrunning it, and generally trying to learn everything they can about it. Reduce friction for player behaviors you want immediately, like sharing content or posting online, and increase friction around engagement you want players to engage with deeply and repeatedly, like speedrunning, exploring your game's narrative and themes, or finding every last secret you've hidden in it. So let's go back to narrative games from the Telltale days. Players who enjoyed these narrative games wanted to learn all the different paths they could go down, and map it out for other players. Very reasonable goals for big fans of a branching narrative game. The trouble was, the friction to figuring out all the different paths was pretty simple, so the maps looked like this. Pretty simple, not that much fun to work on and build. It wasn't an enjoyable activity for their biggest fans, so of course some people were pretty sore about it. Compare that to the maps for Life is Strange or Steins Gate, which both involve some time travel shenanigans, so it's a bit more friction to figure out all the different pathways and causes and effects of the narrative. It's actually fun to figure out all the different causes and effects here. So if your narrative branching is a bit closer to Telltale than to Life is Strange and Steins Gate, you may want to reduce the friction by including all the different branching paths in the game itself, like in AI the Somnium Files. Alternatively, FromSoft games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls have interesting narrative structures because there's a base story that's being told, but you don't have the full perspective on the larger narrative without deeply engaging with the game world. So for the casual player, they may not engage with that larger story through gameplay at all. Instead, they'll engage with the story via the hardcore players digging through every item in the game to construct and relay that larger narrative. But that only works because finding these narrative segments involves a lot of friction. But understanding the world as a whole is entirely dependent on them. Design friction isn't really about making things harder or easier for your players. It's about directing your players' focus. Reduce friction for short-term social behaviors and apply friction to long-term mastery loops. Friction, used well, becomes scaffolding for players to build a stronger relationship with your game. But friction used for evil could also get players to keep playing your game long after it ceases being fun. But that'll be another video. I hope this gave you some ideas on how to treat narrative choices in your next game, and I can't wait to see what you make.